Okay, Numbers chapter 27. It might be hard to believe, but this is the last chapter we're going to cover in the book of Numbers. With a book with such a accounting type name, sounds quite boring. There's been quite a lot of interesting episodes and insights that we've gained. I'm almost sad to end with the book of Numbers or and move on to Deuteronomy, although I can't wait to get into Deuteronomy. Today's story, beginning with verse 1, has a lot of Hebrew names, very difficult names for Papa John. And Jono Vandor, he even says, hey, there are a whole lot of names here, Nehemiah. Do you want to read this? So our Messianic believer from down under, he's going to pass the torch to Nehemiah, who's going to go through some of these Hebrew names. Nehemiah says, these 5 girls have very interesting names. Let me read them to you. And the daughters of Zelophehad. And you'll see in yellow ink, highlighted there, Mr. Z. From now on, when I see that name, Papa John's just going to call him Mr. Z. He's the son of Chapher, the son of Gilad, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, of the family of Manasseh, the son of Joseph or Yosef, came close, and these are the names of his daughters. And he goes through them. But he'll go through them again in a minute. I'm going to just skip them from now. He goes, these are really beautiful names. I'm not sure from the Gentile background and the Christian worldview, these are names you have probably never heard in your life, although they seem more common in Hebrew. He continues, we've got to stop for a minute and talk about those names. And then he says, remember the Midianite princess whose name was Cosbi, which means liar? I'm not sure why he brings that up. He goes, but then we have these 5 girls, and one of them, her name is Milcah, which means princess. And he says, I think that's pretty cool. So we go from one princess to another princess. The first 3 names have to do with dancing. So the daughter, one of them's name is Machla, which means, it comes from the word machol, which means to dance in a circle. And if you've ever seen, and he pronounces this Hebrew word, Hava Nugila. He says that's kind of a throwback to Israeli dancing, where they dance in a ring or in a circle. And so Machla is the ring dancer. And then we got Noah, which is the name of my niece, by the way, Nehemiah says. But that's distinct from Noah, which we have in English as Noah, the guy who made the ark. So this is the ka sound that comes on the end of this poor girl's name. And what does it mean? It means to sway or to shake. And again, having to do with dancing. And then we've got chachla, which means it's a root word for hop, to hop around. So we've got dancing in a ring, swaying and shaking and hopping. And then we've got Milcah, the princess, and Tirzah, which means lovely. So these are pretty cool names. The first 3 have to do with dancing. And I bet that's because Mr. Z had those girls and he started a dance club or something. He was happy to dance, sway, shake, and hop. Anyway, lovely names. So those are the names. Jared Howerson, he's going to kind of change the subject, at least get away from the pronunciation. He says, so now we see why we mentioned the daughters of Mr. Z in chapter 26. The daughters of Mr. Z, they have no brothers. They come forward and they have a question for Moses. See, the law is new, and so we've got a lot of precedents to set. And so the verse reads, and they stood before Moses and before Eleazar the priest, before the princes of all the congregation, by the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, saying. So Howerson says they're going to raise their issue. their big concern. But then he adds, but I love what they're approaching or who they're approaching, Moses and Eleazar. They're the political leaders and the spiritual leaders. They're the local leaders. So God, we're not trying to get around or work behind the scenes. We're out in the open, not trying to make ourselves an exception to the rule, but we really do feel like we are in exceptional circumstances. And rather than just coming up with some new game plan for myself on our own, we would love to hear everyone's opinion on this. We want to be and do this above board. In our day, Halverson adds, if I feel like I'm different or if I feel like a change of policy should be implemented, I'm not protesting here. I'm seeking guidance from leaders generally, general and local, and God Himself. This is a good approach when we differ over something. This is a gentle place to be spiritually, just trying to understand. Well, they go and they ask their question. And Papa John would just interject, we should never be in trouble or feel bad for having questions. And the reason I say that, why? Because questions lead to answers. And that has helped me so much on my journey, on my faith journey, and in my research here in the Papa John episodes. Now, again, our LDS scholar Jared Halverson continues reading. Our father died in the wilderness, and he was not in the company of them that gathered themselves together against Jehovah, in the company of Korah. He died in his own sins. So, yes, their father, he wasn't perfect. None of us are, but he wasn't a rebel. He wasn't destroyed by God in that way. But when he died, he had no sons. So here's our question. Why should the name of our father be done away from among his family because he hath no son? And here's our proposition. We propose a solution. Give unto us, therefore, a possession among the brethren of our father. So Howerson says, these women are so far ahead of their time. I love the daughters of Mr. Z. I'm going to just have to interject that, you guys. That's too hard of a name for Papa John. Uh, Jared Halverson says, this is women's rights. These are exceptional circumstances seeking specific reconsideration. So if inheritance passes from father to son and there are no sons, then our father is forgotten and he receives no inheritance for his posterity, even though there is some posterity. And you're looking at it. You're looking at us. Is there a way that we could receive that inheritance instead? Continuing with verse 5, Jared Halverson, and Moses brought their cause before Yehovah, like he had in so many other places where we don't have anything established yet. Halverson says, that's a great question. I love that he doesn't automatically assume, well, no, of course not. You're women. This is for men alone. No, Moses realizes your circumstance and your concern makes total sense to me. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. I'm not going to pass hasty judgment in one direction or the other. So he brought the cause before the Lord. He brought it before Yehovah. Now back to Nehemiah Gordon. Here's the fourth time where Moshe, or Moses, doesn't know what the commandment is. Somebody approaches him with a question, he doesn't know what to do, and he brings it before Yehovah. And later in this chapter, we're going to see the significance of that. So let's just call a spade here, okay, guys? What this means is in this system here is that the girls normally, under normal circumstances, didn't inherit land. And he continues. And just to give you an illustration of my family, so I'm the only boy with four sisters, two older and two younger. If we were in biblical times and we were farmers on the land, like all the Israelites were in the ancient times, 98% of the ancient population, really until 200 years ago, were agrarian, working as farmers. So when my father, Nehemiah says, passed away, I would have inherited all the land, and my sisters would have gotten nothing in biblical times. What they would have gotten, I suppose, is what their husbands, their husbands' land, whatever their husbands inherited. But they wouldn't have gotten anything from our family. That was the system that was laid out. In a sense, that was the system that existed before the Torah. So the daughters of Mr. Z came along and say, okay, that's tradition, but is that really fair under the circumstances where our father doesn't have any children? He doesn't have any sons. Rather, he has children but no sons. He's got five wonderful daughters. Why shouldn't we inherit the land? And Moses says, okay, I'll go ask the big guy. I'll ask the creator of the universe and see what he has to say. The answer is that, yeah, they're supposed to get land. If there's no sons, then they inherit land. And then there's a whole chain of succession. So Jono, back to our messianic believer in Australia, he says a whole series of it. Yeah, that's right. It says it's a good thing. And he quotes the verse, and cause the inheritance of their father to pass to them, and you shall speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall cause his inheritance to pass to his daughters. If he has no daughter, then you shall cause his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brother, then you shall cause his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the relative closest to him in his family, and he shall possess it. And it shall be to the children of Israel a statute of judgment, just as Jehovah commanded Moses. And Nehemiah says, now there's a follow up to this in Numbers chapter 36, but maybe we should hold off until we get to Numbers chapter 36. And that's why Papa John said this chapter 27 is a companion verse to chapters 36. So later, if I ever want more information, I know where to look quickly. Now back to our LDS scholar, Jared Halverson. He says, God honors and provides for his daughters as much as he loves and honors and provides for his sons. Then he adds, I love that statement. The daughters of Mr. Z speak right. So Moses said, the daughters of Zelophehad speak right. So honor them. Are we open, Halverson asked, to other people's perspectives and experiences? Are we open to God weighing in on those things? That's key. Sometimes we only do one of the at the expense of the other, and that can go in either direction. There's a contrary here to be proven. The Lord then expounds that not just for the sake of the daughters of Mr. Z, but this is a new precedent. It will then create a new rule for those in exceptional circumstances. If you don't have any sons, then the inheritance goes to the daughters. If you don't have any brothers, then it goes to the siblings. If you don't have any siblings, then it goes to uncles and aunts. If none of those, it goes to the next of kin. Then he closes out this footnote by saying, we're trying to honor what it is that people have been promised. I'm going to scroll down after verse 13. Again, Jared Halverson says, quoting verse 12, Yehovah, I've restored the name. I can't help myself, the Lord. So Yehovah says to Moses, get thee up into this mount Abarim. See the land which I have given unto the children of Israel. And when thou hast seen it, thou also shalt be gathered unto thy people, as Aaron thy brother was gathered. And then Halverson says, and in this case, you forgot why. So go to verse 14. For ye rebelled against my commandments in the desert of Zin, and the strife of the congregation to sanctify me at the water before their eyes. Oh boy. So where we're going now, Papa John, just remember the episode about the water and Moses struck the rock instead of declaring the rock. Now God's addressing that to him personally. Now, Brother Halverson says, Moses, I know what you did was understandable, but it's not inexcusable. I'm not punishing you eternally, but there is a consequence. Where much was given, much is required, and you don't get to go into the promised land. I'm not going to go back on my word on that, but I do want you to see it. You deserve at least that much. In fact, now that I think of it, just wait another millennia or so, and I'll meet you at the Mount of Transfiguration. How's that? You and Elijah will appear to Jesus and Peter, James, and John, and you'll finally get to come to the west side of the Jordan River. For now, though, anyway, come and see. I want you to see where you've been headed this whole time, to catch a glimpse of your glorious destination. Seems like a harsh punishment, but it is interesting how there's such a powerful shadow picture, prophecy within the rock, and how it was a shadow picture that Moses destroyed. But we're going to see many good things from Moses, but I share his suffering or his pain. And he's been, I'm sure, writing the Lord and asking him to change his mind. And the Lord's like, come up this mountain and let's look at it together. But no, I'm not changing my mind. I wish I had more time to spend on that topic. Now, eventually, I'm going to insert more information right here where it says insert info from Michael Rood regarding Moses' failure to declare the rock as a shadow picture of the Messiah. So I will find that, and at some point it will be right here. Verse 15, and Moses spake unto Jehovah, saying, and let Jehovah, the Elohim of the spirits of all flesh, set a man over the congregation, which may go out before them, and which may go in before them, and which may lead them out, and which may bring them in, that the congregation of Jehovah be not as sheep which have no shepherd. And then Halverson says, it's almost like Moses, where are you coming from with that? Do you understand what God just said? Moses, you're not going to go into the promised land, but I want you to see it. But there's no, oh, thank you so much for letting me see. He doesn't push back. So Moses doesn't cop an attitude. He doesn't even protest. He does he doesn't try to justify or explain himself or ask for a reconsideration. He completely trusts God and trusts his judgment and trusts his limits, which lets you know just how close God and Moses really are. Not a word about himself. Instead, he simply says, what about the people? I know it won't be for me, and that's okay, but they need someone. This was the shepherd of the sheep of Jethro, and a good shepherd for the flock of God. Please give them a new shepherd. They'll need someone. And God agrees. And that comes up in verse 18. But before we get there, Papa John has a little insight. It says, in these verses, Moses is very obedient and compliant to God's restriction, prohibiting him from entering the promised land. And also, he's much concerned for the body of the house of Israel as a whole. But we will see in Deuteronomy 3:23 to 26 that he was nothing but. Not only had he complained to the Lord about it, but he shared his complaints with the children of Israel over his frustration. He even complained to the children of Israel, saying that Jehovah was wroth with me for your sakes, assigning the blame towards them and minimizing their own accountability for having done anything wrong. Moses must have had multiple complaint sessions with the Lord, enough of them that Moses informs ancient Israel. And the Lord said unto me, let it suffice thee, speak no more unto me of this matter. Moses might be okay with it by now, or right here in Numbers chapter 27, but I'm sure he had to learn how to deal with this disappointment. And like the good servant of God that he is, he's putting his personal disappointment behind him. Papa John says, may I learn to do as well as he did, as Moses did with, may I do as well with my disappointments in my life. It's interesting to see, like Halverson trying to paint a picture of him being totally submissive, and he is, but yet I think with my studies with Michael Rood, he pointed out that how this became a sore subject in a way, is Moses wouldn't leave it alone, and finally God right here is saying, come up this mountain, I'll let you look at it, we'll look at it together, but you're not going in. Quite interesting. I feel his disappointment. And now we're going to get into the new leader that Moses will set apart. Jared Halverson again. And Jehovah says to Moses, take thee Joshua, the son of Nun. Now I'm going to pause. I'm interrupting. Papa John, I just can't help myself. Take thee Joshua. What's unique about this? Well, again, I didn't know this for most of my life, but Joshua is the name for, in Hebrew, is Yeshua. And Jesus Christ, during his mortal ministry, went by the name Yeshua. Talk about prophetic shadow pictures. Here is a type and a shadow of the future Messiah sharing the same name, taking them into the promised land. I hope we catch the power of that, because it was lost to me because of the English version of the scriptures. All right, back to Brother Halverson. And the Lord, but it's all capitals. And Jehovah says to Moses, take thee Yeshua, the son of Nun, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay thine hand upon him. Set him before Eleazar the priest, and before all the congregation, and give him charge in their sight. And thou shalt put some of thine honor upon him, that all the congregation of the children of Israel may be obedient. Now Halverson's going to expound a little bit. Here we see the passing of the baton. Now we'll still have Deuteronomy, which is kind of his final message from Moses to the people, to renew or reconfirm everything that he's taught them throughout a lifetime. But we're getting to the end of Moses' story chronologically and historically. So the thought of Joshua taking his place is new, but we'll see him when the book of Joshua comes. But for Moses to lay his hands on him, to give him a charge before all the people, to give him some of his glory, to me is frustrating to think of people who set up their successors not for success, but for failure. To leave the cupboard bare, the cupboard bare, to leave things in disarray or a mess, to try to get out of their best moments, and someone else to come in on their worst. But that's not Moses. He's a man keeping the first great commandment, honoring God's decision here, and keeping the second great commandment by honoring and loving the people, wanting them to be well led. So, God, let me honor Joshua. I'll lay my hands on him. I'll lift him up in the eyes of the people so they now follow him just like they followed me. And then Brother Halverson talks about Arnold Freeberg. This is kind of cool, especially for me, Papa John, growing up before the internet. And anyway, in a fireside that Arnold Freeberg or Freiberg has given, and he's the greatest painter of those Book of Mormon and Bible paintings. He was the costume director for Cecil B. DeMille's great classic movie, The Ten Commandments. And when they were filming this scene of Moses ordaining Joshua, Cecil B. DeMille, according to Arnold Freeberg's memory, was a little bit confused about what Charlton Heston should do with his head. Yes, you put your hands on his head, but do you look down at Joshua or do you look up at God? What do you do when you pass the mantle of authority? Well, Freeberg knew so well how to do this. He was a Latter-day Saint, and we do this all the time when we're setting people apart in priesthood blessings and ordinations and such. You don't look up at God as if you're hoping God will honor your request. No, you're authorized. You know you have that authority, so you look down at the person who you're giving the blessing or the ordination, whatever it might be, knowing you have authority from God to do so. And so you bestow that authority upon the next person. And Cecil B. DeMille liked what Freeberg told him, and that went into the final movie that way. Now, I pulled up some pictures. I couldn't help myself. Here's Arnold Freeberg. That's how I've always said it. I've heard other people say Freiberg. Incredible artist. And here's a black and white photo on the left side where he's there with Cecil D. DeMille during the filming of the Ten Commandments movie. And scrolling down, we see the famous George Washington praying painting that he did. A little further down, we have this amazing open, wide angle type painting of the crossing of the Red Sea. Remarkable action. You can almost feel the wind. And here's some amazing, this is why it triggered Papa John so well. When I read the Book of Mormon growing up, and for my friends and family outside of the Book of Mormon or outside of the LDS faith, again, the Book of Mormon's not scripture to you, and that's okay. But these amazing artistic renditions of accounts and stories of what we believe to be the history of the inhabitants of the Americas and God's dealings with them, and considering them actually a remnant of those scattered out of Jerusalem. So these are, we believe, descendants from the Israelites. But look at the muscles he paints on these men. Powerful. And I'm sure artistically they're not even close to reality. But for a young boy reading, it was really, it brought to life the scriptures. Look at this beautiful one of Christ with broad shoulders. I like that instead of this feminine type wimpy guy that you see quite often from classic paintings of the Bible. And who knows what's accurate? Someday we'll find out. But thank you for going with me on that trip down memory lane. Now we're going to turn to a Methodist minister, Keith Johnson. He says, so when I read this passage, there's something that kind of, the thread that jumps off the page for me. The thread has to do with something that you and I talked about a little bit before the program started. It's regarding some of the descriptions and some of the names of Jehovah that we find in Scripture. And so in verse 16, we have Yehovah Eliheinu Har. Oh gosh, let's try this. Yehovah Elihe Haruchot Iho Ba Sar. Yehovah, God of the spirits of all flesh. And the Ruach, the Ruach is the spirit. So here it says the spirits to all flesh. So in verse 18, it says, and Yehovah spake unto Moses, and he says, take this one who we call Joshua, a man in whom is the Ruach, a man in whom is the Spirit. And then Keith Johnson says, and I understand this whole issue of the high priest that will come and that will judge based on having the breastplate and being able to do these things, but there's a Joshua here. Therefore, there are hands that are laid on him. And who has this? Because he has the Spirit. That jumps off the page. He continues. He's not just a good worker that was around Moses. He actually has the Ruach. He has the Spirit. Says Yehovah Elihe Ha Ruchot I Ho Basar. He is Yehovah, who is spirits of all flesh. Then here's this connection. There's this Joshua with the Spirit. And then he says this really radical thing. He says to him, and I love what the Hebrew says, Nehemiah, I want you to share it with people what it says in verse 20. And where it says, Jehovah said to Moses, okay, take Joshua, he's got the Spirit. And then it says, have him stand before Eleazar the priest. Now remember, Eleazar, Papa John interjecting here, he is the son of Aaron. So he's now the high priest. Have him stand before Eleazar the priest and the entire assembly and commission him. Give him some of your authority. Is that what it says in the NIV? Now, Nehemiah, what do you read in that verse? So Nehemiah says, well, it says, Venatata, Venatata mihodcha alav. Give him some of your hod. And hod is glory or splendor. Give him some of your glory. Yeah, that's pretty cool. And Jono Vandor from Australia says, well, at one stage at least, I don't know if he still does, but he had that veil over his face because he had, well, it said horns coming out of his head. But we understand that meant he was shining, wasn't he? He was shining. Nehemiah says, well, yes. What this reminds me of is, if I can get a little bit of off the Torah portion topic, and in 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 9 to 13, it's one of my favorite stories. I think this is important because this is the story where Elijah is about to be taken up to heaven, and he's handing some of his glory over to Elisha. And guess what? It takes place in the same place. That took place on the plains of Moab, opposite of Jericho. And this story in 2 Kings chapter 2 takes place in the plains of Moab, opposite Jericho. So the story opens up in the earlier verses with them crossing over the Jordan from Jericho. Now that's a Torah pearl, Papa John interjecting. Did you realize that both of those accounts where Elijah is passing his mantle over to Elisha, it happened right here? I never knew that. That's pretty cool. Now, Jono Vandor, he responds, and he reads that verse from 2 Kings. And so it was, when they had crossed over, that Elijah said to Elisha, ask, what may I do for you before I am taken away from you? And Elisha said, please let a double portion of your spirit be upon me. And he said, you have asked a hard thing. Now, Nehemiah is going to interrupt here. He says, okay, I've got to stop you there because, Keith, is that what you have in your Bible, a double portion in 2 Kings? It's got this double portion. So this is a great example of a mistranslation that I think pretty much all the translations have this mistranslation. And it's something that archaeology sheds light on. So the Hebrew word for portion here is P, as just P-I pronounced P. And it says P Shanu Yim, which they're saying, okay, they're saying two portions, P's, and then except P in earlier Hebrew doesn't mean a portion. P actually, they found this out when they uncovered these ancient weights in the archaeological excavations. They found a weight that said on it P. It turns out that P is a third of a shekel. And so P shunu Yim means 2/3. So Elisha said, let 2/3 of your spirit be with me. He's not asking for a double portion. I mean, that would have taken some kind of chutzpah, if you know that word in Hebrew. I want to be greater than you. He's asking for 2/3 of his spirit. He's like, you're amazing. I just want 2/3 of what you've got, which would leave him with only 1/3. Now, Keith Johnson says, exactly. And Nehemiah says, yes, that's pretty cool. Jonah says, wow, oh my goodness, I've never heard that before. Nehemiah says, it is kind of a foreshadowing of what happened with Moses, because you know what? Joshua wasn't Moses. He didn't speak to Jehovah face to face, but he was pretty close. He's still an important prophet. And Keith Johnson says, and that's why I wanted to say, Jono, and it was when he stopped here, he says, now give him, and of course it says in English, and this is what caught my attention, give him some of your authority, some of your glory. In that word, in other words, the foreshadowing is let some rub off, right? Give him a piece. Just give him a piece. That's before we've ever talked about the whole idea of the priest who will obtain decisions for him. So the decisions will be what they are, but do you know what's amazing? You can have those decisions made, but you ain't if you ain't got any ruach, if you don't have the spirit, it ain't going to help you. It's not going to help you. That's funny, using the word ain't right there. Now, Jono Vandor responds by saying, this is blowing my mind. Let me just read this again. And so it was when they had crossed over that Elijah said to Elisha, ask, what may I do for you before I am taken away from you? Elisha said, please let 2/3 of your spirit be upon me. That's what you're saying it says? That's 2 Kings 2, 9 and 10? That blows my mind because verse 9, I mean, Keith, how many ministries are out there and they call themselves the double portion or something like that? Well, anyway, okay, let's move on. Nehemiah says, well, wait a second, because there really is such a thing as a double portion. I think maybe they're confused. A double portion is just a translation of the Hebrew um, for inheritance. And what that's for, the firstborn, the Bechorah, the firstborn gets a double portion. What that means is, just so people understand what we're talking about, I gave this scenario where I've got 4 sisters and they've got nothing, but I'm the only boy. Well, if I have 4 brothers and I'm the firstborn, which I'm not, but let's say I was the firstborn son, then you divide up the land into 6 portions. We've got 5 children, and one of them is the firstborn, but you break it up into 6 portions or 6 sections, and the firstborn gets 2 of those portions, a double portion, and the others just get 1/6. But that's what it means by a double portion. And Papa John's just going to interact. What little bit I understand about this is the reason the firstborn always got a double portion was because they also inherited the responsibility for the women, the sisters, and those in need. So they always inherited a double portion. And metaphorically, if we apply that to ourselves, Papa John, just it's not in my notes here. Remember why God attacked Pharaoh's firstborn? Because he considered Israel to be his firstborn. And because Pharaoh was threatening his firstborn, he he directed his anger towards Pharaoh's firstborn. But what that means, if we're ancient Israel and God considers us his firstborn, then with that double portion that he's promised us comes great responsibility to take care of the needy, as he often says, to take care of the widows and the fatherless. That responsibility falls to us as part of Israel. Metaphorically speaking, I think that that seems true from where my understanding is at this point. Now verse 21. And he shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall ask counsel for him after the judgment of Urim. Before Jehovah at his word shall they go out, and at his word they shall come in, both he and all the children of Israel with him, even all the congregation. Now that's a confusing verse, but you see I highlighted in burnt orange, Urim. Well, what do we usually hear after Urim? We hear Thummim. And Nehemiah Gordon is going to talk about that. He says, and just think this is so big. I mean, we talked about the Urim and Thummim. One belief is that it was the lights that would light up. But, but if you actually look at some of the earlier Jewish sources, what they explain is that what caused the light was, well, there were two parchments called the Urim and the Thummim. On those little parchments, it had the name of God on it, the actual name of the Creator, with the Yod He, the Vav He, uh, on those pieces of parchment. When they were inserted into the breastplate of judgment, it then gave this, I don't know what to call it, power, but essentially it turned it into a prophetic device. We don't really know what the Urim and Thummim were. They were they were something in or on the breastplate of judgment. Another place that we see the Urim and Thummim show up is actually on the emblem of the Yale University, Nehemiah says, one of the most prestigious university in the United States. So really, on the emblem of Yale University, going back like to the 1700s or something, it says in Hebrew, Urim v. Thummim as a book. And on the right side of the book, it says Urim. On the left side, it says Thummim. You know, Urim and Thummim. Above that is a translation of Urim and Thummim in Latin. Now, one of the translations of Urim is light, and Thummim would be translated meaning perfection, light and perfection. But some people understood it as related to the word for truth, and so it's translated in Latin as lex et veritas, which means light and truth, which is supposed to be the idea of Yale University. But anyway, that also comes from the Urim and Thummim right here in the Torah. Interesting stuff. In fact, Papa John interjecting here, Harvard has an interesting uh, university logo where they had three books, and one book was and it was open, and it shows it open, and then the second book is open right beside it, and that's the Old Testament and the New Testament. And below it was a book face down but open but facing down, and that was for future revelation that the founders of Harvard were waiting for further light and knowledge. And the book was face down because they had not yet received that. Interesting stuff when you start connecting all these dots. What do you do with this information? I don't know. But the hyperlinks are very active in Papa John's brain tonight. Let's get back to verse 22. And Moses did as Jehovah commanded him, and he took Joshua and set him before Eleazar the priest and before all the congregation. And he laid his hands upon him and gave him a charge, as Jehovah commanded by the hand of Moses. Nehemiah says, wow, there's a lot to talk about in this section. Oh boy, when the first king is chosen over Israel, one of his roles is to judge. If you think about it, that's why when we hear about Solomon, one of the things we hear about is he's sitting in judgment. He's got the story of the two women who both claim the baby is theirs, and he says, cut it in half. Now, why is he sitting in judgment? Because that's one of the functions of the king. He essentially takes on the role of the high judge. Moses had the role of the high judge. We saw that in the story of Jethro. Jethro comes to him and says, look, you're judging the entire nation, 3 million people from morning till evening. You've got to have somebody help you. So he sets up this whole hierarchical system, judges over 50, hundreds, and thousands. But Moses is at the top. And when he doesn't know what to do, we saw what he does. When he doesn't know what to do, he goes and he asks Jehovah. That is a system that is now being extended beyond the life of Moses. Now the authority is being handed over to Joshua. And Joshua, well, what is he supposed to do? He doesn't speak to Jehovah face to face. So what he gets to do is ask the judgment of the Urim. And that's the key of this verse 21. But back in Exodus chapter 28, verse 30, when the breastplate of judgment was being made, and there it says, you shall place on the Goshin of Meshpat the breastplate of judgment, the Urim and the Thummim. They shall be upon the heart of Aaron when he comes before Jehovah, and Aaron shall bear the judgment of the children of Israel upon his heart before Jehovah continually. Now, Aaron, when he dies, is replaced by his son as high priest, who is Eleazar. That's exactly what it says here in verse 19. And you shall stand before Eleazar the priest, before the entire congregation, etc., etc. And then in verse 21, and before Eleazar the priest, he shall stand, and he shall ask the judgment of the Urim before Jehovah. So Joshua, although he's a prophet, although he was given authority by Moses and placed in charge, he still has to ask of the Urim and the Thummim when he doesn't know what to do in matters of interpretation of Scripture. And that's something that we see again in Deuteronomy 17. And I know we're going to get back to that. So Deuteronomy 17, I think, is one of the key passages in the Bible where it says, when a matter is too difficult to you for judgment, and it's talking about going to the Levitical priest and the judge who will be in those days. So who would be the judge in those days? And those essentially are the two roles, the high judge, but the high judge himself has to go and ask the Levitical priest through the Urim and Thummim. This is essentially the system that's been set up in the Torah. Now, what's happened is the rabbis come along about 1,500 years later and they say, well, we don't have a high priest with the Urim and Thummim, so we take that authority for ourselves. And whatever we say goes. You're required to obey us. And they actually imply that Deuteronomy 17 is to them. If you read in the rabbinical writings, they quote these verses as the source of their authority. But if you look in Ezra chapter 262, this is one of my favorite passages, Nehemiah says. Ezra 2, it's a very obscure verse. It talks about these Kohanim, these priests. They can't show their lineage. They can't prove that they're priests. They talk about what they should do. And it says in verse 62 of Ezra 2, and these sought their writing of their genealogy, and they were not found, and they were banished from the priesthood. The governor said to them that they must not eat of the most holy things until a priest could stand with the Urim and Thummim. So this is the key point. Nehemiah says, there was no priest with the Urim and Thummim in the second temple period. So they say, okay, we're going to have to wait for that priest. We're without that teacher who can tell us what to do when we don't know what to do. And Nehemiah says, I quoted this prophecy, I'm sure, before in 2 Chronicles chapter 15, and it says there's this prophecy of Azariah, the son of Oded, and it says, for many days Israel will be without the true God, without the teaching priest, and without the Torah. And Nehemiah says, I believe we're in that period. We're where we don't have anyone who really has the authority of Deuteronomy 17. We've had people who have usurped that authority, who claim that authority, but we don't have a high priest with the Urim and Thummim and someone who is the high priest. We will have that figure, he says, and that will be the Messiah when he comes and reigns as king over Israel. And Nehemiah closes out this footnote and this episode by saying, read Isaiah 11. It talks about him judging. There's that's one of the functions of what he does. The Messiah judging the people as the high judge. Interesting way to close out this episode and to close out the book of Numbers. Let's just wrap it up. I look forward to starting the book of Deuteronomy in the next episode. And between now and then, just continue to be the best example of a believer you can be. That's all we can do at this point. And let these things distill upon your heart and in your mind. And I look forward to talking to you guys all again soon.